Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us here tonight at the Dearborn Public Library. We're very pleased to be talking with Paul Myers about his new book on John Candy. But first, a couple of announcements. We have some great programs coming up. We'll be talking with Team Deacons, Roger and James Deacons, about Roger's new autobiography, Reflections, next week. And then we'll be talking with historian Rick Atkinson. He appears in the new Ken Burns film about his book on the American Revolution in the following week. So please join us then. Uh, well, the format for tonight will be well, pretty much maybe talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then take Q&A afterwards. We're pleased, as I said, we're pleased to be joined by Paul Myers. He's a Canadian writer and musician, and he's written a number of great books. I'm a big Kids in the Hall fan, so I love Kids in the Hall. One dumb guy. He's also wrote books about Todd Rundgren and also the Bare Naked Ladies. So I'm very pleased. Thank you very much, Paul, for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate it.
Now, did you picture yourself as a writer as a kid or more of a musician?
It's funny you should say that because, yeah, for the longest time when I was a kid, like the first thing I wanted to do was be a rock star. I mean, that's what you want. You don't want to be a rock musician, you want to be a rock star.
Of
And,
course.
of course, the Beatles were huge in my life. And then when I went through all the levels of Led Zeppelin worship, I'm a guitar player. And then I went through new wave and punk and Elvis Costello and all those things and singer-songwriters like Joni Mitchell and I was writing songs, I was writing lyrics. And then I wrote a band newsletter that it was an old-fashioned mailer. You'd actually mail it out.
Wow.
And of course, I mailed it out from my day job using their postage meter, which is super appreciated by my boss. And but I started to write long form, two-page newsletters, and I realized I really liked conversing in words, like in typing. And I realized, oh, I never really thought of myself as a writer. I kind of dropped out after, the 12th grade because I just wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a musician. I thought, you don't have to go to school for this. You just learn. You just do it by doing it. And I mean, maybe I was wrong. I wouldn't tell the kids that today. But, so then suddenly I'm a writer. I start writing op-eds for like the Canadian Globe and Mail paper and Toronto Star and different articles for rock magazines. And then somewhere along the line, the Bare Naked Ladies, who you mentioned, they were in my club scene. And like they had had a big hit in America called One Week. And they said, people don't realize we've been together 10 years. Paul, maybe you could write the book about the Bare Naked Ladies and we'll, put it out in our company. So it's kind of an autobiography that I wrote. And sure enough, I could write a whole book. And, maybe it was a rough around the edges book, but gave me the confidence to think about doing more books. And now I'm on my fifth. So the music kind of led to it.
Well, yeah, I know many people are big fans of Bare Naked Ladies. So I bet that really helped them along, both yourself and them.
Yeah, it was an honor for them. It was an honor for me to be asked by them to do that. And I still to this day, bump into Stephen Page or Tyler Stewart from the Bare Naked Ladies, and I tell them, thanks for asking me because it turned into a career. So it was really nice of them to do that.
Yeah, yeah. So um, where did you get the idea for writing the book about John?
Well, so as you mentioned earlier, I'd written a book about the Kids in the Hall, and that's another comedy troupe that I absolutely grew up with. They played the same club scene as me also. And much like the Bare Naked Ladies, I just wanted to go to them and say, listen, I know you guys, I know your story. So I wrote that book for this publishing company in Toronto called House of Anansi Press. And the book did fairly well for the audience that knew about the Kids in the Hall. And the Kids in the Hall actually went out and promoted it with me. It was very cool. And then I wrote a documentary that was won a Canadian Screen Award about the Kids in the Hall based on my book. It was Reg Harkema directed it. It was called a Comedy Punks, and it's on Amazon Prime. And around this time, my publisher said, you should do another book for us. What do you want to do? And I had kept hearing, I kept sort of talking about Second City, the television series, Second City TV's SCTV. And I thought, I want to write a book about SCTV. And then I thought, oh, but Martin Scorsese is making a documentary, which was supposed to have come out already. So about 4 years ago, I said, he's probably got to it before me. But then my editor Nancy said, if you just do John Candy from Second City, then you can talk about all his movies. You can talk about, Uncle Buck and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles and all those things, and his work on SCTV as well. So I was like, can I just do that? Then, yeah, let's do that. And so right away, I just started making a list of all the people I needed to talk to and set about doing that for 3 years.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask how long did it take to do it, and about how many people did you talk to?
I mean, I'd say I haven't really sat down and count. I'm not a numbers guy, but there's a list with about 100 names on it. And I would say I got most of the names. There's a few people that I never did get, but mostly like I was amazed. Like I would have I look at my little Rolodex thing or my scheduler, and I had like Steve Martin on one day, and then 2 days later, Martin Short, and then Catherine O'Hara. I was actually on a trip to England, and I got a call that's or an email that said, she's available by Zoom, but only on this date. So at like 2 in the morning, London, England time, I'm Zooming Catherine
Huh.
O'Hara, one of my lifelong comedy heroes, by the way. And I'm Zooming her in, she was somewhere in Ontario, Canada. And it was just so like I kept having those moments. Dan Aykroyd, who ended up writing the foreword, I interviewed him for a couple of hours on the phone. He was on his farm somewhere in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and he was just walking around with a cell phone telling me everything about John Candy. So these are, for me as a comedy nerd, these are like incredible moments because you try to stay calm because you have information to glean from them, but really you're kind of paying respects to all these great comedy people. One more thing, though. We also talked to people who you might never have heard of, who happened to have been there at the moment when John did something important, or they were working on the crew, or they could attest to what he was like in his private moments because they worked with him. They were on his staff, so his team, And so, what was great about all of that is sort of like Columbo, like a detective. I was trying to put together who is this guy. I had no agenda. I didn't want to prove or disprove anything. I just wanted to like let it tell me the story. And then my job, kind of a solemn responsibility, is to write what I think is probably the truest version of the story, knowing that, the man has passed away. There's no way he can comment on it. And but I just want to be respectful to the family and to all the people who told me their stories about him. Like I'm carrying this, carrying this for them. And that kind of took my ego out of it. So it made me feel like I was in service to the story of John Candy.
Oh, yeah, that's a great approach. And probably the mo most impactful thing, or one of the most impactful things in his life, was the death of his father when he was 5 years old.
Yeah. And I
Uh,
think that's got to affect anyone. Yeah, that's huge.
yeah, I mean, it really had an impact on him. He uh, was always, it was like, well, over his shoulder. Am I going to live that short a time? Uh, I've got to be the man of the house. It just was really, you really brought that forward. You really made, made that important. Do you, uh, uh, was that in the people that you talked to, was that a big thing about his life that people always remarked on it, how he was concerned?
Yeah, a lot of people mention it. I was had the good fortune of working, getting a lot of great information, also articles that were written by this man, Robert Crane Jr. Robert Crane Jr.'s job was to be the press liaison and kind of the PR sideman, like the guy went with John everywhere in the peak period of the 80s. And he talked to me about some of the almost like he had moments of panic attacks and anxiety. And that was not necessarily related to the death of his father, but one of the things he talked about as he approached his own 35th birthday, his father passed away at the age of 35. He he every day after that he thought I'm on borrowed time. In fact, he thought he was on borrowed time anyway. He didn't know how long he was going to live. He knew he was a big man, and he constantly tried to diet, but also liked to eat. He loved to eat. It made him very happy. He's raised by, Eastern European. His mother and his aunt were both Eastern European, so there was always lots of cabbage rolls and coffee at home, and potatoes, and so he associated, I think. I mean, I'm not a doctor obviously, but
No.
classic sort of food is love situation. I think he felt comfort when he had a big meal, but at the same time he was on the Pritikin diet trying to lose weight, so he was constantly aware that there was something, his number could come up at any time. And then when he got to be 40, I think he still had the feeling, but he sort of wondered, like, am I going to go past, like, am I going to go, who knows how long he would have lived, but he did die at 43. So in a weird way, he was kind of right.
And he, he because of his size, he was frequently fat shamed, uh, and that I mean he felt comfortable making fun of himself, but when he was put in situations like on a scene, probably the most famous scene that you talk about in your book, mud wrestling and the stripes, and also if referred to in the press or anything else, he was angry. He was angry about it.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the other thing that was kind of fortunate for me as a journalist to be able to speak with Joe Flaherty from Second City and Dave Thomas from Second City, who both were in Stripes. So they can attest to John's mood on the set when it was decided that the joke of the piece was going to be that the big man in the long johns gets into the mud wrestling pit with the bikini clad women. And the thing about John Candy is, I think he always, you said earlier that he would use comedy about himself to sort of make people at ease, and if you're the one telling the joke, you feel like you're in control, and I think that's something a lot of people who are bullied or shamed, you'll see a lot of comedy where people bring up their own remarkable physical feature as part of the joke, because then they're in on it, they're telling you to laugh at it. But when somebody else is asking you to do it, and you want to make them happy, like John liked to make people happy. So my feeling is, from what I gathered, is that he went along with this scene when Ivan Reitman asked him to do it, the director producer of the film, and I think he didn't want to do it, and kind of privately told Flaherty and Thomas, because he knew those guys from Second City Television. He knew them from the Toronto stage. So those were his oldest friends at that point. So he's fuming privately, goes and does it, kind of says, can we get out of here? I think he makes a joke at the time of like, who wouldn't love being in a mud wrestling pit with naked, barely clad women? At the same time, he's a family man, doesn't really want to do this. He's not, it's not something that he was particularly proud of, and probably never really liked to talk about. I mean, I sadly, again, never got to ask him, but you can tell from the friends. And Ivan Reitman, I spoke to before he passed away, and he sort of didn't remember, or maybe he chose to not remember, just how much John didn't like it. So that makes me think that maybe Candy didn't really go to him with any strong complaints. He didn't want to be a problem. Like, he didn't want to be the actor who's complaining. There's definitely a people pleasing aspect to John Candy that did sort of internalize for him over the years. I think that those anxiety attacks may have come from not wanting to say no to people. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, you're in a big movie. You don't want to ruffle feathers. You you, you want to go along, but but you feel uncomfortable, and so yeah, uh, he was kind of tricked into, you tell the story of how he's tricked into getting comedy in the first place.
Yeah.
Uh, he 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 went for a Second City audition in Toronto with some friends, Valerie Broomfield, one of them.
Bromfield, yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and he's kind of tricked. They kind of tricked him into doing an audition for it.
Yeah. So what happened was, John had been part of the Toronto theater scene, independent theater scene, as an actor, just as a straight actor. And of course, he would do comedy within that, like he would do absurdist plays and things like that. And he loved to get laughs, but he did a lot of avant-garde theater and things that were like kind of serious about, physical challenged people. And like he was in a lot of very innovative plays. And then he hangs out with these actors, and they're all people from the musical Godspell. The Toronto cast of Godspell, of course, famously is young Martin Short, Andrea Martin, Victor Garber, who later went on to do other TV, um, and Eugene Levy. And they were hanging out at this house, and Dan Aykroyd and Valerie Bromfield had come into town from Ottawa, Canada, and they were trying to apply their trade and doing children's theater and different things like that. And they said to John, "Hey, we're auditioning for the inaugural cast of Chicago Second City is opening a Toronto show, and they're auditioning locally. So let's all go down." And he said, "I don't want to do that." But they said, "Well, come with us, and we're all gonna go to lunch afterwards. So just if you could just come and sit at the back, and we'll all go to lunch afterwards. It won't be long." And then, of course, Dan Aykroyd puts his name in the hat, and so John Candy gets called. And the one thing you got to say is he was game. He got up and did it. Did the audition without any kind of background. He just knew how to do it, and he wasn't perfect. And so someone saw a spark in him, and it happened to be a Chicago theater, Second City theater person named Del Close. In comedy stories, you will see the name Del Close because he discovered various people like John Belushi and different Chicago-based people. He was a nurturer of young, interesting talent because he saw a spark in people. And John Candy, he said, "I'm going to take you to Chicago. We're going to teach you how to do improv, right in the fray of it, where Second City was born." And he gets in a cast with young Bill Murray, who had just also been auditioned in Chicago. So the two of them are learning how to do improv together, while Candy is learning from Murray what it's like to live in a big city. I mean, Toronto was a big city, but this was America. Suddenly he's going to juke joints and booze halls, and he's listening to real blues played on the real streets, and doing comedy. And he gets really good after about a year and goes home to Toronto. And that's when he reunites with Aykroyd. For a while was in the cast there. Young Gilda Radner was in the cast. And Catherine O'Hara joins when Gilda Radner goes on a road show with National Lampoon. So they all start playing together, and they all get to know each other. Eugene Levy, Dave Thomas, as I mentioned, Joe Flaherty. And then this sort of school of comedy that they're all kind of learning together, they kind of make it their own. There's a Canadian flavor on the Chicago comedy, and they're all learning the rules of like cooperative theater, because improv is, there's a term they use as yes and. So
Yeah.
someone creates a reality and somebody else says, "Okay, I'm going to play with what you said and I'm going to add something to it." And that
Yeah.
is, like, not to be self-effacing because I'm a Canadian, but that's something Canadians do, is we kind of try to make everyone at ease generally. And at the same time, will offer our opinion. And I think that really stood up for John over the years. Like in everything he did several movies with Eugene Levy, did several things with Dan Aykroyd, worked with Catherine O'Hara on Home Alone, and that they started this thing together. And I feel like they were sort of like the way the Beatles sort of always knew about each other even after the Beatles. They always like sometimes show up in each other's records. And I feel like there's something about the Second City thing. So it was all an accident, kind of, and yet he was so great. There was no way that John Candy wasn't going to be doing comedy.
Well, yeah, I mean, I love Toronto. I've been there several times for the film festival, but I
Mm,
like Peter Ustinov's quote. It's New York is run by the Swiss,
that's
uh,
true.
but in America it's quite different. Uh, Chicago in
But
particular.
Chicago and Toronto have so much in common, which later comes into the story when he meets John Hughes. So when Candy meets John Hughes, like they know a snowy winter, they know hard concrete with ice on it, they know hockey, and they know the Great Lakes. Like because they're both on the Great Lakes system, so like Lake Ontario and Lake Michigan. So it's very much the Northern American states, especially the Midwest, very similar mindset. Like Fargo, North Dakota, and all these places, they're very similar. Minnesota is very much like Canada, so in places, and
Oh yeah.
so I feel like it's not that far of a leap that he sort of ends up his first American experience is Chicago.
Well, yeah. Let's talk about his relationship with John Hughes. I was surprised to hear that they uh, were compadres. They were they really worked well together.
Well, yeah. So what happened was their meeting was also kind of an accident in that John Hughes had written the short story that was National Lampoon's Vacation. He'd written Vacation 50, was it 59, I think 56. You think I would remember the actual year, but it was a piece for it was a short piece and he was a magazine writer. And um, they made this movie, and the ending of the original National Lampoon's Vacation has him has the Chevy Chase character bursting in on the home of a character standing in for Walt Disney. So it's supposed to be Walt Disney, and but legally it's someone else, and he shoots him and kills him in the original screenplay, and it's a comedy, and like not only is there litigious problems with the possibility that it implicates shooting Walt Disney, it's just too graphic and weird. So they had to do a reshoot. They'd already shot the ending, and they had to do a reshoot, which meant they had to cast a security guard for Wally World, which was the amusement park that Chevy Chase goes to. And the person who gets the part is John Candy. And John Candy hits it out of the park. You know, that thing where he goes, sorry, folks, the park's closed. Moose out front should have told you. And, it's very Canadian, actually. It's a character that he'd been doing at Toronto Second City anyway, but he just changed it for the movie. And he does so well that John Hughes is like, oh, who's this guy? And he kind of hits it off with him. And then they realize they have like I said earlier, a lot in common. They're hockey fans, and they both are moving to Hollywood because of work, but they really have, wintry roots, and they both starting families at the same time. So the families get to know each other. They both live in Brentwood, and they have, picnics and cookouts together. And when Hughes starts writing for adults, because you remember Hughes had written for teen comedies for most of his early
Right,
years.
right.
When he starts writing for adults, he starts to see John Candy as one of the sort of muses of, for whatever John Hughes wanted to say about his own adulthood, he'd write a character for John Candy. And so and similarly, he knew John Candy by this point. So when he writes a script like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, he puts in scenes that have such empathy for who John Candy is that John Candy, of course, sees it and goes, "Oh, this script, I'll never get a script as personal as this. This is perfect because he can do broad comedy, but then do that famous scene where he says, 'I like me.'" John Candy saying the lines, "I like me, my wife likes me, what you see is what you get. I'm not going to change because this is working for me." That is such an affirmation of John Candy, and it was written by John Hughes for John Candy, and the two of them couldn't have done the thing without knowing each other. So that relationship, I mean, and the Home Alone thing was a John Hughes production. And of course, Uncle Buck was another John Hughes. And he had him whenever he could, they would work together. And they loved hanging out and talking on the phone all night because that's both of them like to talk on the phone all night. That's something I learned about Candy is he would call up all his friends at 3 in the morning, no matter where he was. He's just one of those guys.
Well, you talk about how he's taught uh, on the phone with everybody. Like his need for that connection was important to him.
It's true. Yeah, well, he liked people. He needed people, I think.
Yeah, yeah. The so SCTV was which I loved. I used to stay up. It was at 12:30 at night, even that on NBC. But it was formed to sort of help keep the Second City stars at home because they were being taken away by Saturday Night Live and also uh, all sorts of the old Fridays TV show
That's
on
right.
ABC. And can you talk about that, how it got formed and
Yeah, so
the
so
importance
so
of
I
it?
mentioned Dan Aykroyd and Gilda Radner. So Dan Aykroyd and Gilda Radner were at Second City, Toronto, and in fact, they were trying. Uh, Andrew Alexander was at this point running Second City. It's a name to remember just because he was the producer of what became Second City Television. Andrew Alexander knew Lorne Michaels from Toronto. They all knew Lorne Michaels, who when he'd been Lorne Michaels had come from Toronto originally. Lorne goes to New York, gets on this crazy show that against all odds is starting to work. And he first cast, he brings in, Aykroyd and Gilda. And he actually brought Valerie Bromfield in for a bit too, which isn't widely talked about. But so they're on the show, and the show's doing well. And of course, everyone knows Lauren wants to take other people, and Candy's one of the big ones, and so is Eugene Levy and Catherine O'Hara, and so he's buzzing around, and then basically Andrew Alexander and Bernie Sahlins from Second City say, we have to create our own TV show, or we're going to lose everybody. But what's neat about this is when they create their own show, they don't have a huge budget to begin with. So they have to do it low budget at a Toronto-based television studio so they don't have big budgets for sets, but what they have is artistic control. And they can make it about whatever they want. And they don't have to be topical. They don't have to do a weekend update piece that talks about the president or the prime minister that week. They can do film parodies about films that only they care about. And because they were not really playing in the majors, they could create a flavor. Like I said earlier, they have their own version of what comedy is. And they created this thing that was different. It wasn't always better than Saturday Night Live or better than the other shows, but what it was unique. And they had such artistic control. Like Andrew kept the suits away. So when NBC started putting money into it, they made sure that the show was being filmed in Edmonton, Canada, to keep it away from, like, no Hollywood executives want to visit Edmonton in the middle of winter. So
Yeah,
they could do all these great things. They did some of their best work in this room. And plus, they were isolated in Edmonton. They didn't even know their Toronto friends there. So they had hotel rooms. And one of the great examples is, I don't know if you remember the Schmengi brothers with
oh,
Eugene
yeah,
Levy. That came out of the two of them bored out of their minds, turning the dial in Edmonton in their hotel, and they see an actual cable access show with a local polka star doing, polka for a bunch of people dancing around. And they said they started talking like this, and they started doing the voices. And then Candy had played a little bit of clarinet, and Levy had played accordion, so they knew kind of how to hold the instruments, and they probably could play, but they weren't really playing on the show. And then those characters were so ingrained in them because they could spend hours riffing together. No one else was going to be hearing this. They just figured we're just going to do this. So by the time they wrote it into the show, this whole idea, like, who else was doing that? And of course, Johnny LaRue. Johnny LaRue is
oh,
John
yeah, yeah,
Candy's. It's a bit John Candy. It's John Candy's worst impulses, and he knew it. Like any vanity or pride or ego, he basically saw it in himself and said, what if I didn't control myself and I was just an egotist and a big bluffer who's trying to pull off scams all the time? And he made Johnny LaRue lovable, even though he was obviously a blowhard. He was a lovable blowhard, and just Johnny LaRue was so tasty as a character. Like I still talk to people who only know Johnny LaRue. Like they just love the Johnny LaRue stuff. So this has excited me to write about because, I have such fond memories of Second City television.
oh, yeah, yeah. That's how when you mentioned how they incorporated musical groups into the show. I remember. Uh, I remember it as yesterday, and it's like then the famous crane shot you talk about,
Oh
and
yeah, yeah,
how uh, Dr. John says, "Don't." It's Polynesian Town as a riff on Chinatown.
yeah, yeah. Don't ask question. Is the Polynesian town? Yeah, like yeah. No, that was it. And he wants the recipe for ribs. His rib sauce. Like
Yeah, and I loved how you said John Kennedy came up with the idea of throwing the televisions in the beginning of the show.
Yeah, that to me that was one of the many fascinating conversations with Dave Thomas. So Dave Thomas came to Second City Stage from being at an ad agency, and he worked in advertising. He understood all that, what I always call that Marshall McLuhan understanding what the real message is in an image. It's not just this; it's something. Don Draper, that whole era of Mad Men, where we're not just selling a cigarette, we're selling a lifestyle. That whole thing, and
Yeah.
And so when John Candy came up with the idea that their show would open with throwing televisions off of, he knew that that was like the 1984. This is years before the 1984 Apple ad, where the runner throws the axe through the screen. Like he knew that this was an image that showed the revolutionary spirit and mayhem and the rock and rollness of Second City, because throwing things out of hotel rooms was kind of a rock star thing, right? Like Keith Moon. So there was all this imagery that was just boiled down to this one image of them throwing TVs off a balcony. So it was like, and that Thomas recognized Candy's almost naive genius for that. Like Candy just threw it out there. He didn't know that it was the hugest image ever, and it worked. It really sold the show for me too.
And yeah, John Candy had a very memorable movie career. What were your favorites of his career?
Well, there's so many. First, he had some great moments in a bunch of films. Like for me, one of the first times I really thought they captured him was in Stripes, when he plays Oxenberger, and it's a story that was a little bit close to what happened to John in real life. Is in real life, John Candy had hoped to join the U.S. Marines from Canada. He drove down to Paris Island. He wanted to join the Marines because he wanted to go through the basic training to lose weight and get in shape, because he thought that would be really good. And in the movie, that I think it's a coincidence that the script called for Oxenberger to make this speech about why he joins the military, and he said, "I want the army to make me a lean, mean fighting machine," and
Yeah,
that was the phrase he uses. And it's the way Candy hits that whole speech. My name's Ox, like short for Oxenberger, blah, Oxenberg. And so he basically has this great scene, and it's a bit of a standout in the show, and he has some great moments in the film. But that speech, there's a bunch of key speeches in his career and I thought in Splash he really brought a lot of stuff. So that was another thing. When he finally does this, what they call two-hander with Tom Hanks, and the conditions are just right, that Tom Hanks isn't a huge star yet, so it's his big moment to be a leading man, and Candy's like the sidekick brother, and it's an opposites brother thing, and they've got Daryl Hannah, and it's just, and Ron Howard also hasn't really established his name very big as much as it would become. And so everybody's a little hungry to make this thing great, and they really made a memorable film for its era. But I mean, if you're talking about the greatest roles, to me, the greatest role is when Hughes wrote him the Del Griffith in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which is very timely because we're in Thanksgiving season. um just it was like I said, a culmination of Candy knew Hughes, Hughes knew Candy. That film for Hughes, I think, is probably one of his best scripts, as certainly of his adult films. He has films for adults, I mean, not adult films. Just the speeches in that, and just the languaging in that, and the fact that it just Candy and Steve Martin, who's trying to tone down his wild, crazy thing, while I think Candy was also trying to bring that actor side, the emotional intelligence that he has as an actor. So he's playing a big man who's acting big, but then there's this heart to him that you see, and you cannot, especially towards the end of the movie, the heart is on display in that film, and it stands out to me. It's you know, I keep making Beatles analogies, but whereas the Beatles were great in movies like Help, Hard Day's Night was the film that really showed the Beatles' soul, and I think Planes, Trains, and Automobiles was the film that showed John Candy's soul. You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. It comes from the heart. Uh, if you had you've mentioned before how your brother met him, but if you had a chance to meet him, what would you ask him?
Well, now, wow. I mean, if I would ask him how he managed to be so positive with everybody all the time, even when, even when he was being body shamed by journalists, and even when some of the films didn't take off, and sometimes he was found himself in a film that wasn't the film he thought he was going to do. And I would just ask him, how he managed to maintain the positive mental attitude, um, just, and where he found it in him to bring generosity, kindness, empathy, and compassion. Seriously, he's that guy. He brought all that to everything he did. And I like I said, I didn't have an agenda, but one of the things I was curious about was there ever a time when he was a nasty person? And I never found it. I've heard places there were stories where he stood up for himself and was very, he told people to get lost who were abusing other people, or not even like, not sexually abusing, but like people who were like people being mistreated. He didn't like to see people mistreated, and himself. If you gave him a bad deal, or you tried to use an ad that said he was a fatty, he would just cut you out of his life, because you shouldn't do that to John Candy. So he was no pushover, but he found a way to have kindness and empathy with everybody. And that's why he's kind of worthy of a book 30 years after his passing, 31 years after his passing. I think, it was a rewarding study for me. It kind of taught me life lessons. Like I'm just like, be more like John. It was kind of a rewarding process in a lot of levels.
Well, is that kind of emotion, that kind of feeling, is that what you think is causing this reevaluation of his life between your book and the documentary on Amazon?
Yeah, I think, the term they often use in smarter people than myself, right, is zeitgeist. The idea that there's a cultural moment that you can't force. It's just the time to talk about this. And I think, without getting overtly political, but you can read between the lines, there's a lot of cruelty in higher office, in places now, in pop culture, and in sort of political culture, a lot of lack of empathy, a lot of cruelty. And I think that a lot of people hunger for a time when our role models were standing for kindness. And I don't know if we speak this out loud. I don't think we go, let's all do this together, because it's an internalized thing. Something just feels right. And I think also Candy hasn't been hammered down, hammered to everyone. Like, sometimes we like to find things. So if we're always told this was the thing, this was the thing, this was the thing, you might suddenly find yourself, but what about John Candy? Why haven't we talked about John Candy? And then, just really coincidentally, the Ryan Reynolds was producing this documentary for the Candy survivors, the Candy family, and they brought Colin Hanks in to direct it. And I will tell you a little story quickly, if you don't mind. Um,
Sure.
whenever I get a book deal about somebody who has passed away, or somebody who's still alive even, first call is to try and get the people closest to the person, so you can also explain your that you don't have an agenda, and that you're going to be respectful, and put them at ease,
Yeah.
but also to
Yeah.
get their input if they can do it.
Right.
Jennifer Candy Sullivan, who is a really lovely person, she's the daughter of John Candy, and I said, "Hey, I don't know if you know me. My brother's was at Second City Stage, and we're big fans of John Candy. I did the Kids in the Hall book, and I know a lot of people at Second City like you do." And I'm going to do a book about John Candy, and I would love you, your brother Chris, and your mother Rose to be part of it. And she wrote me back a respectful email, and she said, "Oh, Paul, we know you're going to do." I'm paraphrasing, but we know you're going to do a good job. We know who you are. I can tell you're a straight dealer, but we're doing our own movie. She didn't tell me anything about it, but she said we got home movies and archival footage, and we want to do a thing about our dad, and we're going to do this thing. So we're not going to be participating in any other projects. And I was like, a little like, oh, that's too bad, but excited to hear what you guys do as a film. And she
Right.
kind of gave me the blessing. And then I heard Ryan Reynolds on socials was saying something about how, I'd love to produce a documentary about John Candy. And I'm like, that sounds like somebody who's already producing a film about John Candy. So I tried to contact them, but I think that there's also gatekeepers who were sort of keeping the they didn't want to, like, maybe for intellectual property reasons, they didn't want the
Sure.
guy, so they didn't play. And then Colin Hanks was kind of somebody I'd talked to on socials, and he also wouldn't like talk to me, but I didn't take it personally. I understand how these things work. But the good news about not taking it personally is the PS to the whole story is the week my book comes out, it's October 7th was the date our book came out. Their film was going to streaming on October 10th, and they had been doing a tour at various theaters where they have an onstage interview with Ryan Reynolds and some other guests, and they have different guests in different towns. The last date on their tour was October 13th, and I was scheduled to start my book tour on October 14th. I get a phone call from Ryan Reynolds after not speaking to me at all. he calls and goes, "Hey, buddy, so your book's out. That's great. We'd love you to come out to the Boston show and be our guest on stage, and we'll talk about being John Candy celebrators, like, and Stephen Page from Bare Naked Ladies is going to play a song, like, and I'm like, Stephen, my old friend, the first book I ever wrote, and he's good friends with Ryan, and Dan Pasternak was hosting. He's a comedy mensch that I know. He's a great guy, and I was like, oh, the only problem is I don't know if I can get to Boston and then go to Edmonton where I'm starting my book tour. It's Alberta, and there was storms in Boston, and I was like, this is. He said, don't worry, we can get you first class in and out. We'll get you. You won't miss your Edmonton date. Like, this is the power of Ryan Reynolds. So Ryan flies me in. We do this thing at the uh, oh, what's it? Schubert Theater, the Schubert Theater in Boston. It's so beautiful. Stephen and Paige and I reunite, and Stephen sings "What a Good Boy," which is a song that Ryan says typifies the John Candy spirit. And then we all sing "If I Had $1 Million," which was a Bare Naked Ladies song. We all sing it on stage at the end, and it's like a beautiful thing. I get in a plane next morning, two planes actually, through Denver, make it to Edmonton, and finally flop on a hotel bed after this Edmonton show. And like Ryan Reynolds made that happen. And then Ryan goes, like last week, he does a social media post where he just says the loveliest things. Like, he talks about the lyrical quality of my book and how he learned stuff from it. And like, seriously, both my parents have passed away, but they wouldn't have even written this nice. Like, this was the nicest thing anyone's ever said about my writing, but also a major endorsement by another candyologist of my book. So it's just fascinating to me that, again, I think it's because we're in service of John Candy and not our own egos on this. I think it's not about, I mean, I'm happy he said I was a good writer, of course, but I think what we're really talking about is, isn't it great that we get to tell the story of John Candy? And it wouldn't be the same if it was just a book about something that was about feeding my ego or some kind of whim of mine. I'm serving, I mean, not that, like, I'm not doing a huge social service to the world, but I'm giving this statement about John Candy that feels good for me to say. So that's as, to me, that was poetry, that moment, that poetry of life, that Ryan Reynolds reached out to me again, modeling the kind of behavior I would like to do for someone else someday. So
But
it's a great happy ending to that.
yeah, I always believe if you put positiveness out, you'll get positiveness in return. And you kind of hint or talk about how uh, some of the people that you talk to uh, still feel a kind of loss
Yeah.
about his death, that they haven't come to complete terms with it.
It's true. It's true. Like, Catherine O'Hara um gets very quiet, when she's talking about John. She's a very religious person to begin with, and but she feels a spiritual sense of his presence, maybe a ghost, but maybe just some version of what we can't describe. His energy visits her in dreams and stuff like that. And they get very quiet. Steve Martin, you may have heard serious Steve Martin. When you ever hear Steve Martin talking very seriously, he's a very smart, deep person, and he's not wild and crazy at all. And one of the things that I was moving for me was he was, describing these scenes that he shot that weren't in the movie, and he's describing this to me, and he said, I think he said he struck me as a man who had a broken heart at the center of himself. And this was, ordinarily you talk about people and they want to give you all the happy stories, but Dave Thomas talked about it, and they both, all these people seem to be feeling like, to talk about John Candy right now is to also revisit the loss. But the loss is a presence too. Like, the hole in their life is still present, you know, and it didn't just grow over. And, that's why they have such, I don't think people talk to me. I don't think all these stars talk to me because it was me. They were talking because they wanted to say to the universe, John Candy mattered. John Candy mattered personally. John Candy mattered as a human, and he mattered as a performer. So I think, again, that's the stewardship I had, the feeling of responsibility. Like, these people are entrusting me with these very personal shares, and I better get it right. That's sort of how I feel.
Yeah, and I feel like you did. I feel
Oh, thank you.
that, yeah, I really enjoyed the book. So
Thank you.
let's take some time for some questions. If you're online, just write your question in the chat, and then here in the auditorium, any of you have a question?
How many children did they have, and where's John buried?
Okay, yeah, maybe you're asking about his family life. Did he have, you mentioned his daughter, and I think he had a son also.
Yes, yeah, two children.
And he had a very uh, contented sounded life with his wife, Rose.
Yeah.
Maybe
So
talk about that.
his wife Rose is a painter and sculptor, and her work's online. I think her Instagram account is Hello Rose, Rose. And I love her style. I didn't know anything about her work. She does ceramics and stuff as well. And she, they were like, teenage sweethearts, and they got married, and she was there for all of it. And, was just constantly at his side. And then when they started having children, Jennifer Candy, light of his life, and then Chris Candy, and those two kids, who also have this connection with their father now because they also lost their father at a very young age. So now they can relate to their father losing his father at a very young age, and they're very eloquent about what their life was like. But they're also very passionate about, and they're all both work in the comedy and theatrical sphere, and they both are great at that. But one of the things they speak out about is mental health because there's a feeling that their father internalized a lot. I'm not putting words in their mouth, but I could see why. Like their father, late in life, John Candy went and got therapy, and he said I should have started early. In one of the interviews I found, he said I should have started this years ago because there was things he didn't work out about being a people pleaser and the loss of his dad and everything. And they also, the Candy kids also speak about taking care of your physical health because congenital heart ailments and stuff like that. Very important to be mentally on top of your mental health, but also on top of your physical health. And those are, if there's anything, that they can learn that to help themselves and others, they're working on that. And they strike me as very well-rounded people. And I think their father and mother modeled the same kind of empathy and love that, you know, I think it stayed with them, and I think they're probably, I don't know, obviously Jennifer has kids of her own now, I think, and they're just they're just nice people, and they were raised by nice people. So it's another great story there. The cycle of niceness.
Uh, yeah, definitely. All right, so let's check this question online. Offended. Yeah, did John Candy get offended if a person called him fat when he's putting out that person out at the same time? Yeah, we kind of covered how uh, he was very defensive about his weight when it came to other people's comments.
Yeah, I think, you could be cut out of his life pretty easily if you pushed it too much in that department. It just because he didn't want to be around you if you were going to be like that. But I've seen there's interviews you can find online with, does everyone know what I mean by a press junket interview where there's several reporters come in one at a time and they have the two shot? There was this
Yeah.
one particular reporter who I forget her name. I think I actually remember her name, but I don't want to say her name. But she did a lot of these, and all her stuff's online right now. And the stuff with John Candy, she literally says to John at one point, "So you're a leading man in this film. How do you manage to do that when you're such a big fat guy?" And John Candy does a take to the camera that, like, if you've watched The Office, the TV show, the way people do like an aside to the camera, like, "Are you getting this? Did she just say that to me?" And but at the same time he laughs, but you can also see he kind of starts to cut the interview short. He starts to go, "Well, they just, I make a movie and that's what we do. Got any other questions?" Because you can tell it's like this is going to end soon because I'm not enjoying this at all. And he's polite. You know, I guess it's like, remember I said the Canadians are like Minnesotans. Minnesota nice, which is not nice at all. You know, that whole thing.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
where you're Minnesota nice. It's like, oh, how are you doing? Or Texas when they say God bless you, well, bless your heart. You know,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
he could be nice to you at the same time as he was letting you know that you shouldn't have done that. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, any other questions? Okay. Final question. He really, I was really impressed how you described the work he put in to be a dramatic actor,
Hmm.
to find dramatic roles and really put the effort in to improve his skills that way, like in JFK and other things. Do you think he would have been just as much a great dramatic actor as a comedic actor?
Yes, I absolutely do. So the thing that he brought, and I was alluding to this earlier, emotional intelligence. Like, so he could play in the hands of any other comic, perhaps. The big broad comedy characters, they could have just been about the physical comedy. But John Candy brought a soul to those characters, and he brought the thing that actors do. And when he did get a chance to do dramatic work, like in JFK, where he worked really diligently to get the New Orleans accent just right. He worked with a vocal dialect coach. And he also worked on, there's this thing in the book he talks about tuning in. The character is both afraid for his own life, but also threatening Kevin Costner's character. So somebody who's both afraid and menacing at the same time. That is an actor's thing to dial that stuff in. To be able to do that, you know, and not just say, I'm going to play this guy as Foghorn Leghorn, basically, because he could have just done the voice, boy, could have just done like that, but he didn't. He
Yeah.
studied the right voice and got the right emotional tenor. And Oliver Stone noted it. Oliver Stone would talk about it in press, and he said, mark my words, this guy could be, you know, he could be on the Academy Awards red carpet because he has it in him, and he displays it every so often. I want to say this: if he'd been offered something like Good Will Hunting was for Robin Williams, if he'd been given a role like that where he got to play or Marty for Ernest Borgnine or something like that, he could have played a character that was serious but had like a humanity to him that made him be pleasant when he wanted to be, or even funny at times. But he could have done this thing, and I'm almost sure that if he'd lived, he would have done that. And he would have also directed, I think. I think he learned so much about directing from working with a lot of great directors. So I think it's more the shame that he passed away at 43, you know.
Yeah, yeah, he was definitely an actor that I enjoyed seeing, and it made me laugh. And your book really brought that home. So thank you very much, Paul. Paul's book is available at the House of Nancy Press website and all the usual retailers, uh, either corporate or independent. And uh, I want to thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here and to get to talk about John Candy. I really appreciate your questions are great, and thank you so much.
You're welcome. Take care.
Bye.